Welcome, everybody. Um, let's see. My name is Keto. If you don't know me, I work for Keep Growing Detroit. I coordinate our education programming along with my co-host today, Lola, and one of our staff members, one of our co-directors, T. Um, we got a lot of great classes on the horizon this summer, spring and summer. So please keep an eye out for that stuff. Today's focus is talking about perennial fruit. Um, and there is tons of, there's tons of information to share. Um, and I'm going to start with showing you my slides here. Okay, and let me make this full screen. Okay. So we got a ton of information to cover. I'm going to go through and on some of the foundational things of what we actually can grow here in Michigan and in the Detroit area. And then we're going to slowly dig down into the details of some of the more common fruit and some of the uncommon stuff, and then get into some maintenance and care, talk about pruning. And for those who are interested in bramble pruning and tree pruning, we're going to touch on that some. And then we'll talk about pruning of, pest management and fertility management. So that's kind of a overview ballpark. And so let's just dig in. So this is, again, just kind of what summarizing what I just said, what we can and cannot grow, what to plant, considering where. So site placement is very important. We will talk a little bit, and reference some slides on how to plant this stuff, ongoing care, and then how to go about thinking about dealing with pests. So just a note, if you have questions, go along as I kind of go through each section. I'll try and address questions. If you could put your questions in the chat. I already see there's some, there's some questions there, and Lola's going to help me stay on top of those. So generally speaking, why we're interested in raising fruit at home, just gives me, I guess, the ability to look at some more of the unique varieties, or, explore and have fun with learning about different types of fruit that are not common or are harder to grow or are not commonly able to be bought at the store or at the farmer's market. It just gives you control over the source of your fruit and the quality, and you can pick it when it's best. But just a caveat here is that essentially there's work that requires, just like gardening. I think that most people probably have figured this out by now, is that if you're a gardener, it's a labor of love. Work and time go into producing these things. I'm going to talk about some of the things that are easier to manage and easier to get fruit sooner, and are less kind of complicated to grow. But in the end, they do, all these things require seasonal maintenance and care, and it takes time and energy. But the bonus of that is it gets us outside in the garden, which is so good for our health for so many reasons, in terms of physical activity and access to fresh air. And there's also a lot of conversations about interacting with the soil and how that has health benefits as well. So there's lots to it. So we're going to be going through tree fruits. And so that's apples, pears, peaches. There are other tree fruits that you can grow in Michigan, but they're more finicky to get to fruit, like plums, for instance. Plums are one of those things that we, for a number of years, used to sell during our perennial fruit sale. But I just was never hearing anybody saying they were getting successful fruit harvests, and they were always, or even fruit set. And it turns out that plums in our region are finicky to grow based on, on frost. And we're going to kind of get into that a little bit more. But ultimately, I would say smaller fruits like strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, grapes, and we're going to get into some of the more unusual ones. Smaller fruits are much easier to grow. As a general statement, they come into fruit sooner. They tend to have less pest problems. They take up less space. So particularly if you're growing in a small area, some of these smaller fruit varieties are probably a better option. Tree fruits tend to take at least 3 to 5 years to come into fruit. And I started to type there, difficult to, it's difficult to stay on top of, some of the pest management strategies and disease management strategies, like to really or grow, to try and grow organic fruit that looks beautiful and perfect, requires, staying on top of degree days and knowing the pests that you're dealing with and knowing their life cycles and different trigger points and the weather. So it can get kind of complicated. Does that mean you can't grow tree fruit and enjoy it? No. I mean, I know a number of gardens that are doing just fine, but you just kind of have to accept that maybe your fruit will look slightly imperfect, but you knew you grew it, so you know what was going on with it. So I think that's a reasonable caveat. So I've been growing, a lot of this is coming from my personal perspective. I've been on my own growing fruit for the past 10, 15 years, and managing our fruit sale and helping growers establish fruit stuff. So I've done a lot of research and gone to conferences and interacted with our local extension, to kind of come to a lot of the information that I'm sharing here. And this is some of my anecdotal information about what I think are, things that grow easiest or are more perform the best in our region. Some things that are a little bit more finicky to grow. And then, just to state, in some case, just to state that, some things we just can't grow here. So going down the list, a lot of those smaller berry type things, raspberries, strawberries, blackberries, grapes, pawpaw. I'll get into those a little bit more, but that's a larger fruit that looks kind of like a mango. Currants, gooseberries, peaches do real well. Saskatoons are another one, we'll get, and if you're not familiar, we'll talk more about that later. As I mentioned a little bit, apples and pears are like some of those tree fruit. You can get them to grow. They just take a little patience, and some TLC. Some of the things like plums and apricots, hardy kiwis and hardy figs are finicky, based on our climate. And what often happens with them is, in the case of plums and apricots, the way that their bloom time lands, they tend to be one of the early bloomers. And if we get a frost after that, then you're going to lose that harvester this year. So, I've heard that even the best, kind of most experienced orchardists in Michigan, will get a harvest maybe every 3 to 5 years. So is that really, and if those trees only live 15 to 20 years, is it really worth the effort? I mean, they're still pretty, you still get the bloom. And if you're just going for that and you're not worried about it so much, then that's fine. The kiwis and figs, kiwis are, I think, another thing that's affected by bloom loss. And figs are like borderline able to grow in our region. And you have to do a lot of mulching and special tarping around them to protect them from the hard cold. And just to note, anything tropical like citrus, it's just not going to work here.
Quick question, Keto.
Yeah.
Where do cherries, elderberry, and goji fruit fit in?
We will. Oh, cherries, I'm sorry, cherries should have been on that tree list. Elderberries would be in the good list. Cherries would be in the good list, particularly tart cherries. Goji, I don't have any experience with, and I don't know of anybody who's got it to grow. I mean, I know that you can see it in catalogs. I don't know anybody who's got that rolling yet. It's in theory that it works for our climate, in our grow zone 6B, but I don't have practical experience. Okay, and let's get into hardiness zones. As a quick refresher for those who, or just introduction for those who may be not familiar, this is a chart for Michigan that references hardiness zones. So this is a good information to know when you are shopping for different types of fruit. Always look at what the hardiness zone is, especially if it's something unusual like gojis. Like look at, is it, say, hardy hardy down to 6B, or is it hardy down to 7? If it's 7, that's more of a southern climate, more of a temperate climate, and you're gonna struggle to get that to survive in our region. So just as a note, we're 6A, 6B currently in Michigan's for hardiness zones.
Do any of the fruit that you listed before, do some of them grow well in Detroit, but not necessarily in the rest of the state? Leslie's wondering.
Well, you can see that Detroit has kind of got that pocket around it where it's like 5B outside of kind of the pocket of where Detroit is, and then we're in 6A or 6B. I mean, I would say generally most of the things we're going to be talking about will grow in most of southern Michigan. Once you can see things start to change a bit once you get up to mid-Michigan and it's a little bit colder, and that's going to affect the overwinter capabilities of some of these things. And then on the coast and like near waters, there's things that would impact how the fruit would develop. But I think generally speaking, most of the things are going to be in the same kind of, will go well in all the things I'm going to be talking today are going to thrive well in lower Michigan. Just a note on frost-free days. This particularly applies to fruit trees. This is another thing to consider when you're shopping for things, is how many frost-free days does it require to fully mature? So, for example, Detroit area averages 164 frost-free days. On the west side of the state, it's slightly more. And if we wanted to try and grow something like Red Delicious, it would be a little bit finicky to be able to get that fruit to fully mature without getting hit by a frost. They're at risk. So that when you're shopping, you're going to also reference, looking at and knowing that we have 164 frost-free days here in Detroit area, that you're going to use that when you're thinking about what types of, in this case, apples, for instance, that would apply to some of the other tree fruits, particularly the larger home fruits. So cherries are going to be less so, but peaches, plums, pears, apples, I would say the main ones that you're thinking about frost-free days for in so just going over understanding how fruit develop. At the end of this season, thinking about next year's fruit, the buds for next year's fruit are going to develop this year at the end of the season. So Um, and then once those buds, like on this picture on the right, are going to stay dormant, and um, hopefully they don't start to open before a frost hits, because if they start to open before a frost hits, then they could be lost to that frost. But that's just a little bit of biology review. So, and then just a little bit more about overwintering. Um, you know, many of the tree fruits, grapes, and summer raspberries, their buds are exposed. They're up above the ground and uh, during the winter months, and then things like strawberries and fall raspberries have their buds protected. Um, so that's just another frame of reference. Um, this is another way that the weather impacts fruit is critical low temperatures. So if we have a string of days um, that are below any of these numbers, that's going to also impact, even if the buds have not opened yet, that's also going to impact fruit development. So apples, apricots, blueberries, which we can't really grow in Detroit anyways because of the pH, cherries, and so forth. So, I mean, it's rare for us to have, I think if anything, we maybe had, I don't know, chime in if in the chat if you can remember, but I think maybe we had a few degrees below zero this past winter. So this doesn't happen very often, but if like if when we have one of those years where the temperatures get really, really low, that's going to impact fruit production for the following season. Um, and so that early season, the earlier in the season that a fruit will flower, fruit tree will flower, or a fruit plant will flower, the more susceptible it is to fruit loss because of frost. So here, here's a spectrum here on at the top are the things that bloom the earliest, and then towards the bottom, you can see that towards the bottom are the things that I've kind of outlined earlier when I was talking. They tend to be the more better performers, peaches notwithstanding. Okay, so just a review on site selection for all fruit. So when you're choosing where you're going to be planting things, you should definitely consider sunlight is a really important thing to think through. So all day sun is going to be for most all of these things, and I'll give caveats when we get into the details of some of the varieties. So all day is best for sunlight. Um, Soil requirements, sandy loam to clay loam, which essentially means, you want soil that is good. It is not a low-lying area, is not compacted, has, reasonable fertility, or you've been working on that by adding compost periodically, or other kind of amendments. We're going to be talking about soil tests a little bit later, but soil pH is part of that piece of the puzzle. Generally, our Detroit soils tend to be on the higher end of the soil pH spectrum, so that's a factor to consider. Um, so, basically, you in terms of soil, you really want to think through, and if you have the ability, maybe spend this year prepping the soil for where you're going to grow fruit and then plant it next year, because it's not like your vegetable garden where you can kind of, where you're dealing with annual crops and you can adjust as you go or do a short season thing, or, most fruit that you're planting, particularly fruit trees, that, that tree is going to be there for the next 15 or 20 years. So putting some energy and effort into preparing the soil ahead of time, amending with compost, looking at some of the fertility recommendations that we're going to be discussing, that's really going to be to your benefit and to being able to produce higher quality fruit, more quality fruit. And then finally, really think through space as well. It's really common for folks to get really excited about planting. I'm going to plant peaches and I'm going to plant raspberries and strawberries, and I'm in my vegetable garden, and I only have this much space to work with. I only have, a 20 by 20 area. So, there's definitely some recommendations on spacing for all of these things. The general recommendation for fruit trees, for instance, is 15 feet. And we'll kind of tap through that as we're going into the specific varieties, but refer to that spacing and try and go out in the space and think, critically about where these plants are going to go in the space is going to really help you not be frustrated down a road on, that, I think because oftentimes when we get some of this plant material, it looks relatively small and we don't, we just are looking at what's right in front of our faces. And, a fruit tree, for instance, usually comes as a whip, which is basically, it just looks like, a 1/4 inch diameter or a 1/2 inch diameter or 3/4 inch diameter stick that's 4 feet long with some roots on the bottom of it. Well, ultimately, that's going to get to 4, 5, 6, 6 inches in diameter trunk with a spread of 15 feet of branches. And so you got to consider that in the critical thinking about how you're going to place things in the landscape. And then, just a quick reference to the, if you're planting in a vacant lot, not in like a backyard setting, if you're planting in a vacant lot, the Detroit Planning Department has setback requirements. You can't be right up, you can't be right up on the sidewalk. I believe you have to be either 10 or 15 feet back from the sidewalk. And they're for line of sight. And then I think the same thing for the back of the lot. You need to be 10 to 15 from the back, and 5 feet from, the tip of the branches need to be 5 feet. So the canopy needs to be, within 5 feet of your neighbor's property line. Here's a quick reference on some of these crops' tolerance to poorly drained soil. It doesn't go through the whole list of things that we've been talking about, but it just gives a general sense that if you have some harder soils that are harder to grow in, apples and pears are going to do a lot better than peaches and nectarines. And if you're dealing with that situation, one remedy for that is to plant in berm. So kind of basically lifting the root mass up above and essentially where it's occupying space above that low-lying saturated area. So thinking through fruit types and varieties. So I'm going to just to specifically explain what each of these terms mean. So a fruit type would be apple, pear, peach, etc. A variety would be Golden Delicious apple versus Fuji versus Gala versus Honeycrisp or whatever. And then rootstocks, and rootstocks is primarily referring to fruit tree rootstocks. Is the vast majority of fruit trees that we grow are grafted onto a particular type of rootstock. We'll get to some images of that. But so how the rootstocks function is They're, the cultivators of these varieties over time have, made observations in nature on, trees that were really tolerant to cold temperatures, or, the rootstock helps affect the size of the tree. So there's dwarf rootstock, or there's semi-dwarf rootstock, or there's standard rootstock. And some of them are selected because of they affect disease resistance. Um, and they have really exciting names like M111 and T12 and things like that. But essentially, that's one of the things we reference when we're looking at the type of tree we want to buy is, the rootstock. Because if we're looking at looking for performers in potentially poor soil, then, there are some varieties of rootstock that work for that. And what we do is they take that rootstock and they graft the particular variety of apple or pear or whatever onto that rootstock. So it's not like you're grafting apple on a pear or that kind of thing. It's more apple onto apple, but uh, a gala uh, uh, scion or branch is grafted onto a M111 rootstock.
Hey, Keto, I have a quick question for you.
Yes.
Talitha's wondering if you could talk about the berm a little bit more. She has a full-size cherry tree growing in marsh soil and is wondering if a berm could help.
So this is, if you could look at the indentation here in the soil, that would be like what you would excavate, that little cutout area where you want the tree to be. And then you would take, assuming that the topsoil that exists there is reasonable and reasonable quality, then you would combine that with about, try and amend that with about, 5 or 6 gallon, 5-gallon buckets of compost. So mix that together with the existing soil, and then fill in the bottom of that hole, place the tree in place, and then fill the soil in around, using this image as kind of an example. If you want more, I'm going to say on some of these things, I'm going to go into some detail. If you need much more detail than that, I'd be happy to talk to you, offline. We can set up a time to chat. A few other notes from this slide is if you're thinking about continual harvest, you can look at the harvest time. You want to be harvesting fruit in general all throughout the season. You can kind of do that. There are things that start to fruit in at the end of May or beginning of June, and then there's things that are at the end of June and July, and then some things that fruit in July, August, and September. So you could, in theory, be harvesting fruit from your garden, all summer into fall. And if you do some planning ahead and some strategic thinking about, about harvest successions, then, that is something to think through. Some tree fruit types may require a pollinizer partner. So, cross-pollination is a factor, particularly for fruit trees. So apple trees need cross-pollinators. Pears need cross-pollinators. Some cherries need cross-pollinators. Some plums need cross-pollinators. So it's just getting to know these things a little bit more. And you also want to know what is a good pollination partner. As a note, for these kinds of things, like if you're buying the fruit through Keep Growing Detroit, we try and take that, we think that through. So the pears that we distributed this year are good cross pollinators for each other, as an example. Like that's something that we try and build in, so you guys don't have to do extra legwork on that end of things. And then some things are self-fruitful pollinizing. So examples, peaches pollinate themselves, tart cherries, grapes, raspberries, strawberries, blueberries. And then, those things I was talking about need that cross pollination, would be the self unfruitful, like apples, pears, sweet cherries, plums, and such on. Um, and in that case, the unfruit, that are not, oftentimes they need, um, uh, not the same variety, and um, that's where you're using a reference, something similar to this, and a lot of the fruit suppliers provide them, where there's a cross chart where you can look and say, okay, I want to get Stanley plums, and it looks like NY66. Well, that's not a great example, but it looks like, or it looks like there's NY66, what a very exciting named plum, is a great pollinator for that. Or if I'm looking at, um, Castleton, Stanley is a good pollinator for that. Okay. Um, choosing pollination, compatible pollination combinations. So just to review, or just kind of, I said this a little bit before, but you need, in terms of pollinators, it's got to be, in the same family, apples to pollinate apples, and they have to be blooming at the same time, and they have to be good pollen producers. But, referencing these types of charts like here, is a good place to start. And there are some other resources online that would be available, and I can help share those information. Any questions?
There's some questions, but some of them we can save till the end.
Okay. All right, this is the image I was referencing earlier in terms of, scion and rootstock, and where the graft union is. This is just to familiarize yourself a little bit. If you're getting, perennial fruit trees for the first time this year, this is what the bottom of them would look similar to. They're bare root. This is how they come, oftentimes when people are getting, mail order tree fruit, or, through distributions like we do. Um, so, um, you know, the it's good to have a visual understanding of where the graft union is, where that bulging knot is just above where the roots are, because that's going to play a factor in how high, you're using that as a point of reference for when you're planting the tree. These are some examples of rootstocks. We don't need to spend much time on this, just that these are some of how they affect mature heights. Um, this is a good reference for, um, how long does it take for these trees to come into fruit, and life expectancy of these trees. So peaches and plums, for instance, only live up to 12 years. Um, and, but apples and pears, can live 30 or 40, 40 plus years. So in terms of where to get fruit, I know a lot of folks have ordered tree fruit through us, and hopefully you're able to get your order in this year. Apologies if you weren't able to make it through. We are currently sold out. Um, we tried to pre-order, anticipate what the orders were going to be this year, and we knew that our suppliers were low, and it just sold out much quicker than we expected. We'll try and plan accordingly next year. But there are a few other really good resources here, that you can check out for online ordering, well, most of these are online ordering, but there are at the top are some Michigan local options. Grandpa's Orchard is, kind of an extension of where we get, some of our tree fruit. South Meadow Fruit Gardens, has been around for a long time, and they have, some interesting, unique varieties. Oikos Tree Crops is, they're really focused on, um, more of really unusual things like, uh, sand cherries and, things kind of off the beaten path that will go, and beach plums are another example that will grow well in Michigan's climate, but are less common, as the typical peach pear plum kind of thing. And then in terms of other like regional or other mail orders across the country, Fedco Trees is really great. They have a fun catalog with all kinds of cool illustrations in it. And then Indiana Berry Company is a solid. That's one of the places that we get some of our berries from. Okay, digging in a little bit. Now we're going to start to focus on some of these crops and their specifics. So strawberries are relatively easy to grow. They didn't include the planting of instruction illustration, but essentially, think of, can you see my hand? Okay, think of my hand as the crown. Okay, so my fingers are the roots, and right here is where all the leaves and it's all kind of, there's this massive roots, all these kind of threads hanging down, and then you see like the beginnings of where the leaf and everything are. So it's got to be right at that line between the roots and the what's going to become the leaves that you see on the screen. You want to plant strawberries right on that line, not lower. You don't want the leaves and ultimately the fruit to be below the ground level, and you don't want the crown or any part of the roots to be above the ground. And it's a little bit finicky when you're planting them, but there are some really good, if you look up strawberry planting, some good illustrations will come up, and I'll be sure to include that in the slides when I upgrade this. So strawberries are one of the stars of relatively easy to grow, are pretty prolific, always delicious. We had some amazing strawberries at KGD Farm last year. You can get a crop in the first year, and they will send off runners. They send off little daughter plants that come off in little vines off the side of them, which you can also replant. So you can also, you can start with a particular area of bed that you're growing and slowly expand it by slowly transplanting the daughter plants that come off the strawberries. There's 3 general classes of strawberries. There's June bearing, ever bearing, and day neutral. Ever bearers produce fruit kind of all in the long days of summer, but it's like a fruit here or there. June bearing is similar, but the fruit tend to have like more of a harvest season. So if you want a garden snack, and it to be kind of going on throughout the summer, everbearers is maybe a better way to go during the summer months. The variety Honey Eye that we are distributing this year is a June bearing variety. If you're a market grower, it's I think more ideal because you're getting the fruit all at once. My understanding is that in terms of total harvest from the 2 types is about the same. It's just the everbearers spread it out and the June bearers are all kind of at once or all during a certain harvest window. They prefer full sun. They don't really like to be planted after things that are related to tomatoes, like potatoes, green peppers, things in the solanaceous family. They are prone to weed competition because they are so low growing that they can get dominated if you don't stay on top of weeds. So for the June bearing variety, it's recommended late in the summer that you what's called renovate them, which is basically to run your lawnmower over them, not super low, but just a intentionally cutting off most of the mature leaves to encourage younger leaves to sprout out, and to get light into the center of the plant, because they're going to be, these are the, in the late season, late summer, we're trying to encourage, the development of the buds that are going to be the following season's fruit. Moving on to brambles. So brambles would include red raspberries, black raspberries, and then some of the different colors, purple and golden. Blackberries, which is a cousin of the raspberries, and then black currants, red currants, and gooseberries. There are essentially two categories of raspberries. The summer bearing are produced once a year on that year's growth in the fall, in the late summer in July. So new growth that's starting now grows up into a cane and it fruits this July. And then everbearing, which is what we're distributing, the heritage variety that we're distributing this year as part of our sale, is they bear on second year canes. So canes from that have been existing since last summer. They're going to be produce fruit on those, and then again on new canes that are going to be are growing now, that are going to be will fruit in late summer. In that case, similar to the summer berry. So I tend to lean towards the everbearing because you get two kind of flushes of berries, and they're a little bit easier to maintain. As you can see, in the notes here, that the summer bearing tend to produce long, relatively weak canes, so just a little bit more maintenance and pruning. We'll get into a little bit more about pruning in a second here. In terms of planting any of these brambles that I mentioned before, including the blackberries, currants, gooseberries, and such, they do appreciate full sun, but they can do okay in partial shade. My observation about that is they tend to have slightly less, they tend to be slightly less productive in part shade. You're going to be spacing these plants 2 to 3 feet apart. They'll get mature height 3 to 5 feet, and typically will begin to fruit in the second season. Most of these types of the blackberries, the raspberries, not so much the currants or the gooseberries, but the blackberries and the raspberries will send up suckers, or send up young plants in and around the plant. It'll send up new growth every year, so it'll slowly spread, and so you can use that to your advantage, and dig those up, and if you similar to strawberries, and to slowly make your growing zone bigger for those things. Sometimes they grow, and if they're left unkept, that little raspberry plant that you planted in the corner of your garden and forgot about will ultimately become a huge patch. And I'm sure some of you have experienced that, at the parks, or at the back of an unkept property, where there's just a huge bramble patch of raspberries or whatever. And the problem, and that's kind of cool, but then it's hard to get to the center of that to get to the fruit. So just keeping on top of that maintenance, whether digging them out or just pruning them off at ground level, will help you stay on top of having reasonable harvests.
Quick question about bramble suckers. Marilyn's wondering if you have to clip them off like tomatoes.
When I say sucker, it's different. I'm more talking about it goes under the ground, it sends out a runner and comes up again. So It's in the case of tomatoes, you're pruning those suckers to encourage fruit growth and less green growth, and discourage green growth. In case of the raspberry, we would want to remove those to have access, to when we're managing the size of our plot and how big we want it to be. So we could dig it up and plant it 2 feet away from our, down the row from our other plantings. And that would probably be one strategy. They're relatively low maintenance. They do require annual pruning, and there is an emerging pest problem called the spotted wing Drosophila. And I'm not gonna have enough time to get into the details of dealing with spotted wing Drosophila, but I have an info sheet that I was planning to share with folks afterward. I guess I'll take 1 minute here. I wanted to mention I will be sharing my slides and some resources after the class because there's so much information to cover, and I'm going through some of these things quickly. I tried to kind of line it up, lay it out where you could click through the slides later, and to help you remember, some of the information. So hopefully that's helpful to you. As a note, the difference between, one visual difference between raspberries is they have no core, and blackberries have a core. Okay, pruning raspberries. So this is a visual reference of where the black, stems coming out of the ground is what we want to ultimately get to. And then the gray stuff is what we would ultimately remove. This is also an example of a training, using a training system that might be helpful. Essentially, when you're pruning raspberries, the first thing you want to remove is dead, diseased, and dying. So on the right hand here, you can see that dead branches will tend to have cracked or split bark. They will tend to look a little more purplish and old and kind of beat up. Those branches, I always like to do those first because it clears out the noise and you can kind of see what you're dealing with. So go through and prune out those first. And then, and the difference is the alive branches, like referenced here, are going to be, they're just going to look younger and newer. And you can juxtapose these two relatively easily. And then the second thing you're going to do is thinning. You're going to thin, like it's referencing here in this slide, 3 to 5 canes every couple of feet. And because ultimately they're gonna send up more, young growth. Part of the reasoning there is you're trying to get more sunlight into the center of the plant. Sunlight into the center of the plant means more fruit. And then third would be what's called heading back. And so a lot of this applies to blackberries as well. They'll tend to get long, like 6 feet, 8 feet long. Blackberries in particular. Raspberries are more like 4 to 6, but they'll get tall and they'll get spindly and spread out and be just a little bit of a hazard, and then also not so easy to access the inside of the plant. So if you head back early in the spring, around now, if you head back or cut back the plant to 3 or 4, roughly 3 feet, 4 feet, 3.5. Right. What that does is it encourages lateral branching. There's a phenomenon called apical dominance. So a plant will tend to grow out the tip more, but if you cut back that tip, there's a chemical signaling that happens within the plant that encourages side branching. and more side branching in the case of the raspberries would be, one of the places where the fruit would be produced. Okay, I'm going to keep going here. Now here's another example of trellis for blackberries and raspberries. A quick note on blueberries. So blueberries are delicious, and there are some really awesome blueberry growers here in Michigan. But unfortunately, the nature of Detroit soil and the soil in our specific pocket of Michigan is that our soil tends to be closer in pH to 7.0 or higher. And blueberries really require acidic soil. And you may say, well, I'll just amend it with a bunch of pine needles, or I'll do things to acidify the soil. And yeah, you can try that. But anecdotally, I know some people who've tried it. You can keep the plant alive and maybe get a harvest for a year, but it's really an uphill battle. You're trying to get a plant to do something in soil that's not very happy about. So I really would not recommend growing blueberries in Detroit. Any questions before I move on?
Some folks are wondering if you can grow blueberries in large containers and provide the acidic soil, and someone else is wondering about maybe doing it in a raised bed.
Some people have, I don't know. Yes, I think you can experiment with that. But if you are doing it in containers, then you need to think about winterizing them, because the part of the soil, the roots need, a certain amount of protection that they get naturally by, with the heat of the earth, the existing heat that comes off of the earth helps in the insulation of the soil around it. So I know people have talked about that. In theory, that it's reasonable. It also, anything, if you get into containers at all, you will quickly learn that watering becomes the next hurdle, because containers tend to dry out really quickly. So that's it. It may be another management thing that you have to take on after that, is giving them adequate water. I'm not, the only thing that occurs to me that maybe is like compromising to the plant is like, if I think about when I would go to the blueberry patch to pick in Dexter, for instance, those plants are 5 or 6 feet tall. And, common knowledge about most plants' root systems is that, their height and their drip line, there's going to be almost equal roots below the ground. So if you're trying to take a, 5, 6 foot plant, how big of a pot do you have to put that in for it to be happy ultimately? I mean, could you fit the root, could you fit a purchased plant into a 10-gallon pot? Yeah, probably. How long is that going to really keep that plant happy is my question. I know that, so those, jury's out. Prove me wrong. Elderberries. Elderberries are really darn easy. So they partial shade. This is a really cool landscape plant because they have kind of a cool base kind of branching system, and when they flower, they're beautiful. This plant here at the bottom is relatively short. The ones I have in my yard are like 12 or 15 feet tall. Ultimately, they're going to get pretty large.
Bring down the
let's see what else we got here. They prefer partial shade and rather be cool cool and moist than hot and dry, but, they can tolerate full sun. Earthworks is growing them over by their big farm area, and they're doing just fine there. The fruit tend to be, kind of small. They're little like pea-sized fruit, or maybe even slightly smaller, depending on the variety, and can be somewhat tedious to harvest. How I've gotten around that is I just cut off the whole. You see this cluster here? They call it the umbel. I harvest the whole umbel. I cut that off, and I put all those in a bucket, and I put them in the freezer. And once they're frozen, they're easier to pop out without, just like kind of roll them off with your fingers without squishing the fruit. For those who aren't familiar, they're highly nutritious and commonly used as an immune booster. And I think the biggest problem I would see, or challenge I would see with growing them, is harvesting them before the birds get to them. If they start to change color, pay attention if you want to get that harvest. Or even what tends to happen is they'll, like, some of the fruit on the cluster will mature, but some of it will still be not quite purple or whatever. So I would tend to try and harvest that slightly sooner, because you will end up with, you'll come out the next day and the birds have just gone to town and you lost your harvest. Same with grapes. I need to grab some water real quick. Give me a second. How are we doing that time? Okay. Any questions about elderberry before I move on? No. Okay.
Do elderberries grow well near black? Do elderberries grow well near black walnut trees?
Good question. The issue with black walnuts is jugalone, not to be confused with juggalo. And it's a chemical thing that affects some plants and not others. I'm not quite sure. I would, my understanding is that it affects some things more than others, particularly, but I would just say what cannot grow. I would have to do some research to get the answer. Saskatoons. These are, believe it or not, a cousin of apples. These are a plant that grows really well in our region. They're also known as Juneberries, or service berries. They tend to fruit in May. They have a sweet, nutty, almond-like flavor, and if they're a good quality, they have some blueberry type flavors. They look a lot like blueberries, but they're not the same. They're super high in protein and antioxidants, relatively easy to grow, low maintenance and care, spaced 3 to 6 feet apart, shade tolerant, and another winner. I like these guys. Okay. Pawpaws. I love pawpaws. I'm a huge fan. I've got so this is the largest edible fruit native to North America. It is a distant cousin of things like mangoes. They are also called the Hoosier banana. They have a lot of kind of colloquial names. They grow really well here, and they're relatively low maintenance. The fruit gets 3 to 6 inches, and they're kind of oblong. The texture is kind of custard-like, and it's somewhat hard to describe, but people talk about referencing flavors like banana, mango, and strawberry. Lola, what would you say about the flavor?
Yeah, definitely mango-like, and maybe a little bit like There's a fruit that looks like it that grows in Jamaica that I'm blanking on the name of it, but yeah.
Okay.
Cool
Super
fruit.
fun. You can find them in some of our regional parks that are along they tend to grow along water edges. If you're really excited about them, there's some really cool varieties from Peterson's Pawpaws. Check out their website. Okay, getting into growing grapes. Another one with relatively low care and maintenance. The biggest thing with them is they require trellising or some kind of support system and annual pruning, and then staying on top of harvest before the critters get to them. Here are some images for reference of a few, trellis post systems. For pruning, so basically when you get a great plant, it's just this little, usually it's just like this little twig with some roots on it. Ultimately, it's going to get to a trunk, 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter, and it's going to send out 12 to 15 feet of vine growth each season. And so you want to get on a routine of harvesting pruning the majority of those that growth off every spring. So you let it grow, and then you prune it back to a kind of a simplified system. Something akin to this. These are two options. Essentially, you want 1 to 2 main trunks, and then off of those 2 to 4 canes with 15 to 20 buds on each of them, and then you're removing everything else off of that plant. So this is an example where there's tons of vines coming off of that plant, and you're taking off just about the majority of it. Some notes on planting fruit trees. Where generally speaking, most fruit trees, when you're purchasing them, is something that happens in the spring. Springtime planting is emphasized because it gives the plants a little bit of time to adjust and their roots to start to develop before they get the stress of the summer sun and and the intensity of the summer weather. Always focus on keeping the roots from drying out and cut off damaged root tips. Tamp the soil down around the roots gently while filling the hole and settle it in. So, like, for example, here, we're going to use this as a reference. So imagine, this root system at the bottom of this image, and you're going to dig a hole about twice the width of the root mass there. It may not be much bigger than 6 inches, 6 or 8 inches wide, and you want to dig a hole a couple feet in diameter and a couple feet deep. And when you're removing the soil, if it's a grassed area, remove the sod first, the top of the sod off, slice that off, set it aside. And then as you're digging the hole, you'll notice that there's, the quality of the soil is going to change at some point. You're going to dig down, and after you get through some of the topsoil, you will tend to get to what's called subsoil. It's different for every site, and some people have better quality or deeper topsoil than others. But essentially, what I want to just focus on here is to keep, if you can, keep the topsoil separate, and then as you continue to dig the hole, put the subsoil off to the side because it's lesser quality. Subsoil also tends to have smell bad, or that's one indicator that you've hit the subsoil, is like it smells more anaerobic or sour, funky. And then when you're planting these trees, then you have some compost on site, mix that with that topsoil, and then you're going to use that to plant the tree. And this is referring to coming back to the bud union. We're going to make sure that when we're planting this tree, we want the bud unit, we always want the bud unit to be above the soil line. Because if the bud union is planted below the soil line, then the side or the buds or the root stock can take over and start growing out, from that original rootstock, genetics. So this is an example of that, where this tree on the left was planted too deep, and you can see that there's roots coming off of the grafting unit. Okay, spending some time on fertility. All healthy fruit trees are heavy feeders that remove large quantities of mineral nutrients from the soil. So, each one of these plants varies to some degree, but the reality is, if it's perennial, it's removing nutrients from the soil every season. It's pulling nutrients up into the material, into the leaves, into the fruit, and we need to somehow replenish that in the soil. Part of what we're trying to do to address that is preparing the site beforehand, taking that soil test, and interpreting that, and getting into any kind of amendments we want to apply, and always incorporating compost, really important. And then as time goes on, you should think about some kind of fertilizer schedule for these plants. There is no magic or exact way to recommend fertilizer, because it's very much site dependent. Some people are dealing with soils that are much poorer than others. And, just kind of continuing my point here, how much and how often should I fertilize? So essentially, start with the soil test, and then, work on things to adjust the soil pH. There are some really good references, such as the Backyard Orchardist. Hold on. I'll show references. I have some example books here. Backyard Orchardist by Stella Otto is really great. Lo, if you wouldn't mind typing that in the chat. And the Backyard Berry book. Also, the Apple Grower is really good for a more organic. And then, these days, a lot of these, if you're interested in the organic-based fertilizers, a lot of the granular fertilizers, you can find types of at the local hardware store. Also, Uncle Luke's in Troy is like a grain and feed store that carries a lot of organic fertilizer, and you can buy it in like 50-pound bags, and you can maybe save a little money because you're buying more volume. And so that's another place to find that kind of stuff. Okay, so we're going to take a second here and look at a soil test to interpret this. Give me a second. Soil test example. Okay. Okay, can you guys see this? Ola, can you see the soil test on my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Sorry, is it in your slideshow?
Yeah, no. Am I still showing my slideshow?
Yeah.
I
think you have to
want
reshare.
change it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think you have to reshare your screen to select the window that you want.
Thank you. New share. That one. Share. Okay. How's that? Am I there? I think so. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Yep.
Okay. So this is, if you get a soil test through Keep Growing Detroit, this is an example of what you would be getting back.
Could you also touch on how to do a soil test through KGD too?
Yes. Okay, let's start there. If you are a member of the Garden Resource Program, we want you to be safe. And we are particularly concerned with the possibility of lead being in the soil in some of Detroit's urban soils. It's not, it's not something that always happens, but it is not uncommon. And also, soil tests are really helpful for understanding what's going on with our soil, how we can amend it to get the best, possible results for our gardens. So to do a soil test, essentially, you're going to identify the area that you're growing and do one soil test for every 30 foot by 30 foot area approximately. So if you have a garden that's bigger than 30 by 30, you may consider doing more than one soil test. Once you've identified your spot, then you're going to go around and take about a dozen samples. The tools you need are a shovel and a 5-gallon bucket. Take your shovel and put the shovel directly into the soil, pull it up, slide it back about an inch, take it down again. So you get this cake slice of the soil about 6 inches deep. If there's any grass on the top of that, take that off, throw that sample in the bucket, and randomly sample other parts of your garden, specifically where you're growing food, not pathways, into that bucket, mix it all up, take 2 cups out, dry it out, put it in a Ziploc bag, and bring it into us. You get 1 free soil test for your garden. If you want more than 1 test, it's $30 per test. So that's that. Once you get it back, you're going to get something like this in your email box. And this is very helpful for thinking through, in our case today, thinking through your perennial fruit. So we're going to, just as a, first, we'll look at the analysis a little bit, and this is, a lot of numbers and what's phosphorus and why do we use that and what's the value of 3.1. But, essentially, there's the macronutrients, which are kind of the main ones that we're focused on for perennial fruit, and micronutrients are usually less of a concern. And you can see where this is what the value found is, what was in the soil test, what your results were. And then, the next column is the optimum range. Another way of interpreting that for macronutrients is this chart at the bottom with the purple lines. So in this case, phosphorus is really low in the soil the soil test we're looking at. Potassium's doing great, and calcium and magnesium are off the charts. So then we're going to scroll down. This next page talks about recommendations for the home vegetable garden, but we're not going to be concerned with that right now. We're going to go to talk about fruit. And then, so this next one is recommendation for the home brambles establishment. So this is if you're just planting brambles, I would say that this is going to apply relatively well for tree fruit as well. It's just to get a general sense. You start out with knowing that you're low on phosphorus, and then you come down here. You may notice that, if you're familiar with fertilizing at all, that fertilizer usually has 3 numbers on it: N, P, K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are kind of the traditional standard ways of noting what's in a fertilizer bag. But nitrogen is volatile, highly volatile in the soil. So it means that it kind of ebbs and flows in terms of its availability. So, trying to address, it's difficult for the way that they use soil tests to measure nitrogen. It's usually measured more in terms of a percentage. and they give you, some recommendations based on that here. So um, I'm not going to read through this all, but this is basically, this gives you some options. I'm just going to go through nitrogen as an example. So to supply nitrogen, either apply 2 to 2.5 pounds of dry blood meal, or urea, or blah, 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 urea per 100 square feet. So if I have 100 square feet is a 10 by 10 area. So, if you had this, in terms of applying this for a raspberry patch, for instance, you would be, for a, 4 foot wide, 25-foot long, raspberry patch, you would apply roughly 2 to 2.5 pounds of dry blood or something similar, dry blood meal or something similar, if you wanted to go the organic route. So I just wanted to kind of dig in a little bit on that. I think this is a really great reference, and it helps to understand, how these soil tests can be helpful to us. So I'm just gonna, unless there's any questions about soil testing, I'm gonna move on.
Can you repeat how much it costs for each extra test after the first free one if you're a KGD member?
$30.
And then Angela's wondering if there has been any discussion on allowing members to get 2 tests to make up this year to make up for last year, since we weren't able to do testing last year.
That has not been discussed. I'm not sure. That might be a little bit difficult to catch up in that way. I'm not sure if we had the resources, but I would recommend just reaching out directly to Lindsay or Rumando on that one. So another note is just, you gotta, fertilizer is a finicky thing. I am, and personally, like, it's like, when am I going to apply? When do I apply this fertilizer? When's the best thing? When that best time to do it, and how much? And it can be kind of overwhelming and confusing sometimes. So it's good to, like, maybe this is a good, like, early winter or early spring, like, refresher, and kind of get yourself together. Or, basically, if you're doing your soil test right around now, then maybe you're getting yourself online for applying fertility for next season. But the short of it is, I just, the note here is, you just be careful not to apply too much. That could stimulate too much growth, and compromise the quality of the plant, and risking broken branches and things of that sort. And then, if you'll notice if your plant seems it's like it's stunted and not doing much, then that is one indicator that you may be, need to add more fertility. So, and this is kind of referring back to the nitrogen thing. So another way to kind of have a sense of what your fertility is like is to measure your last year's growth. And so you can look at your fruit trees and look at some of the branches that have grown since last year, measure them, and use that measurement in reference to this target growth rate chart to have a sense of if you are on par with average growth rates, or if you're under, then maybe your fertility is too low. And if you're over, maybe your fertility is too high. And you can reference that when in the slides later. Some trees need staking, not all of them, but in particularly if you're going to be growing dwarf trees, then staking is a necessity, because dwarf trees tend to have smaller rootstocks. And in the case like this example here, if there's a really heavy load on that tree, it's just going to topple it over. A note about tree wraps, tree cages, and tree paint. Tree wraps are mostly used for, are intended for winter protection of the base of trees. You may have experienced or be familiar with a tree being girdled, which is basically the bark of the tree around the base of it being chewed out. That's typically a rodent problem when they're, in the middle of winter and they're looking for something to chew on. That tender bark can be appealing to them. So these plastic wraps help protect the base of the tree until it gets better established. So in some cases, white paint is used with, this is, I don't know if it's really necessarily applicable for smaller scale or backyard growers, but if you are concerned, if you have a wide open area in particular, if you don't have kind of the protection of fences and your neighbors' houses and all that to buffer the extreme temperatures and the extreme winds of the cold winter, then white latex paint can help prevent extreme expansion and contraction of the bark on the sunny days during the winter. Be sure and remove those tree wraps during the summer months just to avoid problems. Okay, a minute on pruning tools. We're going to talk about pruning a bit. Okay, so let me come off. I'm doing on time. Okay. And how do I stop share? Okay. So I just want to show a few tools, a few common tools, and talk about pruning. So if you're going to be growing raspberries, any kind of, just most all these fruit trees, you're going to want to have a few baseline tools around for seasonal maintenance. So first one I'm going to say is the standard hand pruners. These are Felco 8s, Felco. Felco is a really great brand. There's also Bahco, Bahco, I believe, Bahco. And then if you are at some of the big box stores, more common ones are Corona and Fiskars. But regardless, you want it to be what's called a bypass pruner, which means the blade, each blade passes each other when it makes the cut. An example of the other kind that you don't want is the anvil type pruner that you see at the bottom here, which is basically a blade that comes down onto a flat surface. I really don't know why they even exist. I don't see the benefit of anvil pruners, but they're out in the world, so people are using them. And then the other really important tool would be a good pair of loppers. These are 2.5 foot handles. It's nice to have a nice long handle. I'm sorry, my magic screen is making it hard to see. Again, you want these to be bypass pruners. And the long handle can be advantageous. And then the third one would be a pruning saw. I got both this pruning saw and these loppers. These are Corona, and these are really good. I like them a lot. Okay, so we'll go back to the slides. So for fruit tree pruning objectives, for young trees, our main objective is to slowly get it into the shape that we want it to be, which I'll go over. And as it gets older, before the tree. So really, we're trying to discourage fruit set for the first handful of years because we want, if the plant is putting energy into producing fruit, then it's not putting that energy into producing roots. It's a lot of energy. It's just like, just like our moms put a lot of energy in bringing us into this world through their bodies. Fruit is the same thing for the tree. So we want to really, first couple years, if the fruit starts to form, I know it sounds terrible, but you should probably pull it off because we want to encourage that root growth. And then for old trees, it's always remove the dead, diseased, and dying, broken limbs, and always trying to work on airflow and increasing light penetration to the center of the plant as it gets older. So you're trying to shape the tree and control its height, and then in some cases you need to be thinning the crop. So when you're pruning, this is the time. This is the time. If you have fruit trees, it's worth going out there and starting to work on the shape of your trees and keeping them in good shape. Man, I never talked this much, I guess. So when you do prune, this picture to the left, it's kind of hard to see, but essentially when we're cutting a branch, we want to cut it. It's hard to illustrate with my hands and show the slides at the same time. I wish I could do both. Well, I'm just going to try and explain it. So you can see that the branch that's intersecting with that thicker branch, the main trunk there, as it intersects, it starts to flare out. It starts to flange into the main trunk, and so we want to be just outside of that. You can see a ring there almost of where that's the spot you want to cut. You never want to cut, an inch out from the branch or 2 inches out. You don't want to leave stubs. You want to cut, into that, what they call the collar, and remove that completely. And really want to emphasize doing a really clean cut and using the right tool for the right job. So going back to the pruning tools for a second, when you look at, I have to show this. So when you look at these loppers, you can see that my finger is about the biggest, branch diameter. Whatever fits in the bottom of the crotch of the two blades, that's the biggest branch you ever want to cut with that particular tool. So in the case of my loppers, it would be, about 3 of my fingers worth. And if it's anything bigger than that, then you would go on to the saw. So you don't want to, because you're just going to be trashing your tools otherwise and working too hard. Okay. Come on. So other times of pruning, summer pruning on apples, suckers, and water sprouts, which I'll explain in a second. We're always trying to encourage trees to have wide angle branches and not narrow angle branches, because as that narrow angle branch matures, and it gets that, and it develops fruit on that branch. It's a weak, that V is a weak spot with under fruit load. You could lose the branch. So let's see, what do I want to get to? This is for most fruit trees, apples, pears, in particular. This is the shape that we're trying to go towards when we're pruning our fruit trees. When we're getting into plums and peaches, this is the more the method that we want to get to, open center. So for that pyramidal shape, a few things I want to note about this. Okay, so we have scaffolds. Let's use some terminology. We got the central leader. That's the branch that's going up the center, and then we have alternating scaffolds. You know, and it could either be, this one's where it's kind of like it steps down each time in this illustration, but they also could be both those branches on the same tier, so to speak. But essentially, what we're looking at is kind of modeling it after. Think of it kind of like a Christmas tree, where there are layers of branches that we're trying to encourage. And so we're thinking about this generally as the shape. And and between those scaffolds, we want to have 1 to 2 feet of open space. So the general philosophy of pruning fruit trees is that you're trying to encourage sunlight to penetrate the center of the plant, because that helps with it helps prevent disease, and it helps encourage fruit development, and it makes it a little bit easier to harvest. And so you're kind of using strategies to encourage that. I mentioned apical dominance earlier. So this is just something to think about, and this is an illustration of how apical dominance works. So if we're trying to encourage branches in this particular area, then we want to cut back the tips of the branch in relation to that to encourage branches down the line. So, this is, what a young developing tree would look like. And this is, some of the training that he's starting to, Bob is trying to do in this picture. And the other thing that you want to think about in terms of that, of this Christmas tree-like shape, is that if you were to imagine looking down from the top, it would be like the spokes of a wheel. So you want to have branches filling out the space with, with adequate space between them, in such a way that you would be able to throw, another kind of analogy is that you're able to throw a football through the branches because there's adequate spacing. It's not so congested that you couldn't be able to do that. Would be able to do that. So we don't have time to dig real deep on pruning. That's a good, I think, summary of pruning for the central leader type. These are some, this is some examples of what would it look like before and after, to start to establish. And if you look at this one as an example, it's kind of counterintuitive, like why, like branches are the things that produce leaves that help this plant stay alive. Why am I removing branches? We're trying to ultimately think about, well, I want this tree to ultimately have, that scaffolding. And so I'm trying to think about what is the scaffold, like I'm trying to develop the scaffolding. So I'm going to select this branch and this branch and this branch, because this is a good start of what I think would be the good, good scaffolding. Pruning is definitely an art, as opposed to a science. It's something that you have to kind of play with over time, and practice. And it can be a really enjoyable meditative experience if you can get into it. Here are some examples of apple trees that have kind of developed that general aesthetic of the central leader and the scaffolds of branches. You know, approximately every 2 feet, you can see those scaffolds there. And then here's that other method again, the open center base method, suited for peaches and Japanese plums. You know, and it just seems like the nature of those plants cater the open center method seems to work better for them. Though I have seen examples of people doing central leader on peaches. And here's an example of before and after pruning. Okay. Moving on to some more maintenance stuff, weed control. In any one of these circumstances, staying on top of weeds is really is going to be an important thing. So weeds are going to compete for nutrients. So if you're letting grass or weeds grow up to the base of your plants, most of these plants have some, not all of their roots are in the top couple inches, but a good amount of them, and probably a good amount of them are absorbing nutrients. So you don't want that competition particularly from grass, because they're that's just going to compromise the health of the plant. There's mention of you could address this with herbicides, but it's just a tricky game, because soil health is another aspect of this whole picture, and soil is a living thing, and you start to introduce herbicides, it just complicates, and this is something that we're trying to ultimately be eating food from. So though it's on this list here, I don't generally recommend it. Okay, spending a little bit of time on pests. So tree fruit pest management. Generally speaking, there are 3 types of insects we want to think about today. There are beneficial insects that maybe help us with parasitizing or eating some of our pest problems. And then the 2 categories of fruit pests are going to be the fruit feeding ones and the foliage and wood eating ones. Insecticides are an option, but in most cases, it's very finicky. It's a hard game to deal with, trying to put these things on and do it in the right time to affect the plant, and to do it in a way that's safe, because these chemicals are intense. And so first and foremost, we want to think about prevention. So preventing problems with diseases and pests. The first line of defense is always, is my plant getting all of the things that it needs? Is it getting enough sunlight, as we mentioned in the beginning? Is it getting enough fertility? Is the soil quality good? Like we were talking about fertility a bit. Is it getting adequate water? We haven't spent much time talking about water, so I'll talk about that for a minute. So water, generally speaking, just like most of our gardens, perennials need 1 inch of water per week, or 1 to 2 inches of water per week. The easiest way to address that for fruit trees would be to water them with a 5-gallon bucket of water a week, is one way to think about it. But particularly as the trees in particular, as they get older, the trees will develop deeper root systems and broader root systems, and they will get to a point where they have the ability to absorb water deeper in the water table so they can kind of take care of themselves as time goes on, outside of when we have really dry periods of time during July and August particularly. But otherwise, just do, I would say, one thorough watering one time a week is a good way to stay on top of water. So all these, so first and foremost, to prevent diseases and pests, we're thinking of how are we giving this plant the best chance by giving it all the things that it needs to thrive. And then after that, we are starting to, work on some of the management things in terms of, pruning, making sure we're removing dead, disease, and dying. And then after that, it's really a wait and see game. There's no magic bullet to not have any pests come into your garden and cause problems. One preventative measure is beneficial insects, and so encouraging beneficial insects by creating habitats for them. There are parasitic wasps and a diversity. Generally speaking, having a diversity of flowering plants at all times of the season, and without being able to get into too many specifics, looking into some of the plants that are good hosts for a lot of the beneficial insects, getting those into your environment. One organic philosophy is biodiversity. The more diverse insect populations that you have, the less there is an opportunity for one to dominate and cause more problems. So yeah, think about beneficial insects. I'm just coming back to my notes here. Right. So after you have, after you've done all that kind of stuff to manage and think about what is going to be, the best for these plants, ultimately you're working towards, doing the best that you can to stay on top of that management. And then it's a wait and see game. And that's where it's important to monitor your plants regularly. Take a look, it's a really good idea to walk through your garden once a week or once every couple of weeks and look at the overall plant. Does it look discolored? Does it look unhappy? Does it look, do you see pest damage? And then you look for examples, so once you see any kind of damage or you see discoloration or things of that sort, then you start to look at some of the reference guides such as these. And there's a lot of these types of things are also on the internet. These two on the left, I believe, are available from MSU Extension. And we have this one on the right here in the office. And if you are working through a pest problem and you're trying to identify it, you can feel free to call the office and we can help you with that. And there's another one for diseases, ID guides. So, there, and then I'm going to I guess I'll dig in a little bit on some of these direct fruit pests. Essentially, to deal with any one of these pest problems, you need to first positively identify what it is. With both pests and diseases, once you've, the tricky thing is, like, once you have it, there's nothing you can do. Once there is, like in this case, there's a maggot in that cherry or whatever. you can't, you can't say that cherry. You can call the plant, in this case, you could call the fruit or remove the fruit that looks like it's affected. But in the case of diseases, like once a disease is on the plant, you have to more think about strategy to prevent it happening. It's hard to address it until afterwards. It's a catch-22 because you don't know until you got it, and it's hard to deal with once you do have it. So there are, different strategies, and I would say, there are ways to, their control strategies are like there's curative sprays, which basically are sprays after the fact, and then there's protective sprays, like kale and clay before the fact. But again, the thing you need to know what your pest pressures are before you start to address them. And generally speaking, a lot of these spray programs, they are dependent on timing of when, this is an example of a spray schedule for apples and crab apples. So for apple scab, you're waiting for, you have green tips on the apples, and then you do your copper spray. And these are some of the chemicals. This is just to give an example. These are mostly chemicals here, but there are some organic alternatives, like there's organic version of pyrethrin, for example. All this to say, to kind of reiterate what I was saying earlier, is it's very difficult, for the home gardener to stay on top of the schedule without it being very time consuming for sprays. So, and just to emphasize, organic pest control is challenging. And as we're running low on time, I'm going to try and get a little bit further into talk about diseases for a minute, and then I want to have a little bit of time at the end for questions. So generally speaking, diseases come in the form of bacteria, fungi, or viruses. As I mentioned, they are hard to detect until symptoms show up, in which case it may be too late. So prevention is the most effective way to control. And monitor plants regularly, signs that they aren't healthy, spots or damage, discoloration, rust or mildew. And then, coming back to the ID resources, and then trying to react accordingly. Just IDing a few that are really bad ones that you want to make sure to know about and trying to address right away. Apple scab. And there are some apple scab resistant varieties. Fire blight is really scary. It can really be a problem for entire orchards. Like, look how this apple orchard got blasted. And then brown rot on stone fruits. Just reiterating, healthy plants are more resistant to disease. Sanitation is really important. So sanitation meaning that, like, if you have, when the leaves fall off the tree, take them off and remove them from the site. Don't, you can, if you have a well-working compost pile, you can compost them, or if you're really concerned, just remove them from the site altogether, but you don't want them to decompose below the tree because that just can proliferate the problem. And there's a few resources here for organic fruit care, the Organic Tree Fruit Growers Association, and Michael Phillips, grow organic apples, and I'll talk about him in a second here. And then I'm going to say that I'm going to spend the last few minutes answering questions. I just want to mention that here's a few books to check out. Oh, come on. Well, this is the apple grower. And then the backyard orchardist. Here, let me turn off my background and see if that. But in the meantime, Lola, would you mind shooting me some questions?
Sure. Um, so earlier on, someone mentioned that they are reading The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wollenben. It's a book about familial connection between trees in a forest, largely aided by beneficial fungus. And this person was wondering, can fruit orchards be grown to nurture these connections? And is there a way to introduce good mycorrhizae
More
to the
correct.
root systems when
Yeah.
planting trees?
Yeah. This guy, Michael Phillips, is a really into that kind of stuff. I attended a workshop with him. Like he's an organic grower, and he's really into fungal growth and mycorrhizae. So mycorrhizae, for those who aren't familiar, is a type of fungus that is naturally occurring in the soil that has a symbiotic relationship with the roots of a lot of perennial fruit plants that help them maintain health and uptake nutrients. So in terms of resources for that, I would say that to definitely check out Michael Phillips and that Grow Organic Apples website that I was referring on the last slide. I don't have a lot of practical experience with it, but I think that there's a lot to be said for that.
Cool. Next question. I planted an apple tree in my yard for the winter in 2019. I want to move it to a new spot. By when should I move it?
So just generally speaking, it's you're still in a pretty good window for transplanting it. I wouldn't, 2019, 2020, 2021. So it's only been a couple years. If I wouldn't wait much longer than a couple years, because the trees are going to really start to get established. A couple notes. I would try when you're digging it out, like dig wide and try and even if you could do that now, like go and what they call root prune, like go and like basically do like a 3 or 4 foot hole around or just slices in the soil around the plant. Don't dig it out. Just you're severing the roots, leaving them in place and causing them to do side branching. So ultimately it'll transplant easier or transplant more successfully, more like it'll take the shock of the transplant better. And then I would try and move it before it leaks out.
Cool.
So in the next probably before May.
Okay. Thoughts on trying to grow fruit trees in a greenhouse?
I would not recommend it. I guess I would wonder why you would want to do that, but I mean, generally speaking, for something that's long season, there's a couple of things. For trees in particular, they are pollinated by bees. Honeybees are actually a big pollinator, and some of those pollinators are weirded out by going inside of greenhouses, or they don't pollinate well, or they don't have a good track record for pollinating well inside of, like, something about the light inside, how the light, through the plastic. That's one thing. Two, the ultimate, it takes, each tree is going to take up a lot of space, and so I'm not sure if it's worth the, in theory, valuable real estate inside of a greenhouse. There are some really great sample examples of growing things like raspberries in greenhouses that I think are if you're because it allows you to get a early harvest on raspberries. I'm not very familiar with trials on strawberries, but I would think that strawberries would probably be something similar. Tree fruit doesn't seem very practical to me. So if you had more to say about that, maybe I could comment more.
Okay. Next question. Should the trunks on baby trees be wrapped to protect against pests and frost?
Um, uh, yeah, I think it's not a bad idea to get a wrap for the bottom of the tree, more so for if you anticipate potential problems with rodents, chewing on the bark during the winter. But it's not going to help with the wrap is not going to help with frost. That was more of the paint situation, which you don't always need. Okay.
There's a lot of questions, so let me know when.
Okay.
So you tell you when you want to.
Yeah. Okay, everybody. I'm going to stick around and answer these questions as much as we can if Lola's willing to hang with me and do it. It is 3:00, so I won't be offended if you decide to go. But if you want your question asked, or I'm sorry, if you want your question answered, then stick around and we'll try and get through them. Let's keep going.
Cool. Cool. What time in spring is best to plant a fruit tree?
As soon as the soil is workable. Usually, most distributors, if you mail order them, or the way that we do our distribution is usually around the beginning of April, because that's kind of an ideal time. This ground's thawed enough. You're not the danger of like really intense weather is relatively low. So yeah, April.
Cool. Can you recommend any effective squirrel deterrents?
A dog. Really, I mean, for what? I mean, for squirrels squirrels get into just about everything. They'll take bites out of tomatoes, they are pretty smart. Sometimes people talk about like old CDs or like shiny flash paper, or things that'll move in the wind and that'll scare them. There is those there's these water sprayers that are motion activated. So like, if you have that set up where it's like they're going to trip the laser when they go to take a bite out of your raspberries, and then the water sprinkler goes off. That would be reasonable, I think, but I don't know how much those things cost. So yeah, squirrels are tricky. I know people who have even trapped them and moved them to like taking them to Rouge Park and stuff. So
we got to do a trapping class. Are there any plants we can put around the fruit trees to help its growth and offer protection from pests?
Ooh, interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about that one. Thanks for bringing that up. Garlic is one thing that garlic or garlic chives, or if you want to make it pretty, you can also do like daffodils. So garlic and garlic chives and the like are supposed to help with plum curculio, or have some evidence of helping with plum curculio, which is one pest. But yeah, as long as they're not like a perennial that's not matting, and it's more of a clumping variety, that it shouldn't really be an issue with competition.
Cool. When you transplant trees, what should you do to prepare the new hole in terms of soil, fertilizer, and water?
You're gonna dig a hole twice the size, twice the width, and think about the depth of the root ball and be at least half again. Dig out, like I was talking about before, with removing the topsoil and separating the subsoil. Mix in compost. Have your soil test on hand and refer to that for maybe amending with fertility. Mulch it with wood chips.
Cool. Strawberries be grown in containers?
Which one?
Strawberries?
Strawberries, yes. Strawberries do fine in containers.
Should tree berries be washed before they're sold at the market?
Tree berries?
Mm-hmm.
Raspberries. Raspberries, I would say probably not, because it's gonna you can't really wash them without affecting the quality and maybe introducing the potential for ultimately for rot. So it would be more of a matter of, if you're selling at market, wash and sanitize your hands and or wear gloves when you're harvesting, and that's probably going to do you just fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you are a market grower and you have questions about, best harvest practices, Amani and Molly would be good folks to check in with. Could you plant brambles between two fruit trees?
Yes.
Is raspberry pruning a hard prune?
No. Hard pruning meaning, do you remove a lot at the time? You never want to
Yeah.
remove more than 30% of the plant at one time, or a cluster at one time. So I would say remove dead disease and dying. And then if you have, and you're trying to, have 3 to 5 stems in a clump, and one clump every 1.5 feet or foot.
When is the best time to prune grapes?
No.
Okay.
Before really, I mean, so pruning in general is before things leaf out for anything. You want to, it's basically after the intensity of the winter, so after January, anywhere between January and the middle of April. But it's getting warm already for us, so it's probably time. I would say if you haven't done it, then you should get on it. I gotta get on mine. So
Ebony, you had a question about semi-dwarf trees. Could you add a little bit more context in the chat if you would like? In the meantime, are there expert fruit tree companies or people within our network that we can consult with about our current trees that are not doing well or have not done well? Someone recommended Singing Tree.
Yeah, Singing Tree's a good resource for tree health in general. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure how Kevin and Emily do on maintenance stuff, but and they're a business, so it would be a fee for service probably in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
You can give me a try. If I can't answer your questions, I might know how to find the answer. So you can drop me a line. I'll see if I can help. Other than that, there are some other resources that I might be able to recommend. Yeah.
Cool. Is email or calling the office fine?
Emails. Yeah. Email probably either way. Yep.
Okay. What type of pruning shape is best for cherries?
I think open base.
Okay. And Ebony clarified, she said she's wondering if we need to support semi-dwarf trees in the same way that you would need to support dwarf trees.
No, semi-dwarf trees is usually have a substantial enough root system that, unless you're in a really if you're in a wide open space I don't know, whatever. You're in a athletic field or something where the wind can just whip across an open field and blast on, those plants. The young plants might need some staking just until they can get their roots established. But once they kind of get established, they can probably, be fine without it.
And in regards to pruning shape for cherries, you said open base is best, right?
Vase, open
Base.
vase.
Okay. Could you share just a little bit about that?
Let me just show the picture again. Here, ask me another question while I'm looking.
When is best to plant fruit trees in the spring? Is it when the ground has thawed?
Yes.
Okay. For raspberry pruning, how much is good to cut back? Is that also 30%?
Isn't that the same question?
I think there was someone asked if raspberry pruning was a hard prune.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll go to that slide next. Okay. And because that'll help.
Okay.
You see this slide? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. This is the open center or open vase method. So you have, if you were looking at this from the top, you wouldn't have a center leader, but you would have like 3 branches that ultimately would look something like this, and then like this. Okay, so that's open center or open base. And then,
Raspberry pruning?
yeah. Okay, so raspberries. If you look at all of the branches here, that's what a patch might look like before you start pruning. And so first you're going to remove dead, diseased, and dying, which is the split, bad looking branches, right? Like you see here. And then you're going to go through, and you see how with the black one, like the black stems, every foot roughly, I would say from this image, every foot is 2 to 5 main stems, and everything else is removed. That's essentially what you're going for. So you ultimately you have a stand with a clump of 3 to 5 branches coming out of the ground every foot or so.
Cool. Someone said that they're not getting any blooming on a 4-year-old apple and pear trees. Any guesses, or would it be best to maybe email you more information?
First line of defense is are you is the tree happy? Are you giving the tree everything that it needs? Does it have does it have adequate sunlight? Does it have adequate fertility? Are you watering it? Does it have adequate water? I would say that lack of blooms would be a sign of stress. And or a sign of not getting, the adequate resources to get to that point in its, in its production. So, other than that, if you want to send me some pictures, I might be able to, it's hard to diagnose based on that much information, but give me a little bit more information or send me a picture and we'll try.
I saw an orchardist video that said that it's best to train your fruit tree branches to grow more downward rather than widespread. Any thoughts on that?
Because I don't know. I'm not familiar. I think I think it's fine. The real emphasis here is trying to encourage strong branches that can hold the weight of the fruit and not break under the load of the fruit if you get to that point. So, bending them down, I think, is not unreasonable.
Okay. How soon after we get our trees and bushes do we need to put them in the ground?
Immediately. Yeah, I really want, we get these things bare root, and we try and line things up that you get them in your hands shortly after that. But we really want to encourage you to get them planted as soon as possible. If that just is not an option for you, then you can heel them in, which is basically where you would dig a shallow hole or cover the roots with you know dig a shallow hole somewhere in your garden, and cover the roots with soil and keep the soil moist. So it's kind of like fake planting or half planting. You're just putting the emphasis is on keeping the roots moist because they're bare root plants.
Mm-hmm.
They're naked.
And last question is, do honeyberries need to be pruned at all?
I don't know. I have some. I haven't pruned them. They didn't grow. They didn't produce a ton of fruit last year, but I also think that was because they maybe lost some of the blossoms to a late frost. I think the rule of removing dead, diseased, and dying is a good, like if you have just like kind of inspect them for that. My without my uninformed intuition is that you probably don't need to do a lot of pruning aside from shaping them a bit. That just knowing the general nature of plants, I would say that's my 2 cents. Yeah.
Cool. I think that's all the questions.
Okay. All right. We did it. Thanks, guys. Woo! And thanks for being my wingman, Lola. I appreciate you.
Got you.
All right, y'all. Well, enjoy the rest of your Saturday, and we'll see you at the next one.